welcome to another episode of Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. This is episode number 53, and I'm so glad that you have decided to join us. I'm your host, Eric Nevins, and on today's episode, we have a very fascinating story. I can't wait to share it with you. Before I get into that, I want to let you know you can find show notes and details of everything that we talk about here today and in every episode of Halfway There at halfwaytherepodcast.com. Just check that out. And while we're at it, I want you to check out the episode with Keith Giles. If you go back in the archives, you'll find that episode. Keith has a very interesting view of the church and politics, and that was a kind of a game changer for me. But if you are in the Denver area, I want to let you know that Keith is coming to Denver, and we need to get a certain number of signups in order to make sure that he can come. And so we only have this week. So if you're listening when this comes out, this is the 12th of June. And by the end of the week, we'd like to have 5 to 10 people sign up. There is a small charge just to cover the cost of having Keith come out to speak to us. It's only $15. It's going to be held at my church. And I will put a link. If you go to the halfwaytherepodcast.com, or Halfway There Podcast Facebook page, I'll put a link there and pin it up at the top. And then also, you can always go to halfwaytherepodcast.com, find, or I'll put a link in this week's show notes and put it on the page so that you can find it easily. But we do need to have some people sign up in order to actually make the event go. So if you're at all interested in politics and how the church interacts with politics, which is a big deal right now, I think there's this authenticity movement among millennials and people in the younger generations that I think is kind of part and parcel with moving the church out of putting our hope into politics and instead putting our hope in Jesus and living like him, which, if you ask me, that's a great thing. Not that we shouldn't be involved in politics, but you know what? That's something that Keith will talk about, and we can always ask him questions. So if you're in the Denver area, please absolutely do sign up for that if you're interested. The date is July 22nd. There we go. Easy for me to say. July 22nd. It's going to be in the afternoon, so that's a Saturday. It'll be right near, if not in, our coffee shop at our church, so we'll have some decent beverages, and you can come and just have a little bit of a discussion. So I would love to have you there. Love to meet you. Love to just talk with you about this important idea, and we'll get into that. And maybe just have some fun at the same time. All right. Well, moving on to today's episode, this is one that I'm excited to bring you. I'm always excited to bring you these stories. I'll tell you what, this is the very best thing that I do in my week. You know, I love finding these stories when people share them with me. This one is actually a guy named Trevor Kapralos, and Trevor found the Lord in a very interesting way. I think I mentioned at the end of last week's episode, I asked the question, can you love someone to Christ if you don't even speak their language? Well, in an interesting way, that sort of happened for Trevor. There were certainly people who spoke English, but I'll let him tell the story about how he came to Christ and how it was not exactly what he was looking for, but it was exactly what he needed, and the Lord was working in his life to bring him there. So, without further ado, I want to introduce you to Trevor Kapralos. Hey, Trevor, welcome to the show.
Hi, Eric. Thank you. Appreciate the invitation to talk.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. It's you and I connected through Rob Karch, who's a previous guest on the show, and who shared his story with us. And if I remember right, you guys are related, right?
Yeah, he's an inspirational brother-in-law for sure.
Your inspirational brother-in-law. Do you have non-inspirational brothers-in-law?
No, no,
Okay.
I was
Okay.
just he's a brother-in-law, comma inspirational.
Perfect. That's good. So yeah, that was great. He was kind enough to introduce me to you, and I'm excited to share your story because it's the part I got to hear was really inspiring to me too. I love the way that God uses different people, and especially people that might be outside of the people we expect. And I think that's some of your story. So that'll be great. Um,
Yes, I think he's definitely has been an unexpected journey.
that's one of the things I love about him most. I think the just his propensity for the unexpected.
Yeah, I think sometimes I wouldn't mind if it were a little more expected. I mean, you could maybe plan around the detours and the hard left turns, but yeah, that's the nature of his plan is
Yeah,
unexpected turns and twists.
right. No joke. Well, cool. Well, where did you grow up?
I grew up in northwestern Connecticut. I'm the oldest of three boys who we grew up in a Catholic home. I was a altar boy, and when I was in high school, I read during church and I taught catechism, but um, I never really understood. There was a lot about Catholicism I didn't understand, and but I didn't know that at the time. So
Sure. But like what? Just the ceremony of it, or the theology?
yeah, all of the above. I mean, I certainly knew the basics, and that hasn't changed. Jesus died; he died for our sins, but I didn't know why we did a lot of things during Mass and why we didn't do things, and um, I don't think I really realized how little I knew until I met my now wife, and the first time I took her to a Catholic church, uh, she had a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. So I really shed a light on just how little I knew about being a Catholic.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I bet that was a conversation that was I want to say interesting, but I bet it kind of brought some things to mind for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would recommend to anyone if they're going to be dating a Bible school educated woman to take her to a Catholic church that you then can't answer even the most basic questions about. It was enlightening to say the least, and rather humbling.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, what did that do to you? Because it must have made you think a little bit more about what you what you actually believed.
I I, I kicked the ground. I probably sought to change the subject and tried to deflect the questions that I couldn't answer. Yeah, I
Gotcha.
mean,
Yeah.
it was it was good. They weren't even hard questions, but for me, I had a hard time answering them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so you grew up in Connecticut in a Catholic family.
Yep.
Um, so then, w- where did you go? Or what did you do? So take us after that. I'm picturing a very sort of traditional Catholic kind of background.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Very traditional. My mom is a devout Catholic. My dad at the time was not. But we faithfully went to church, went to mass every weekend. Um, I grew up, and when I graduated from high school, I moved away to college. I went to Syracuse University in upstate New York, and I definitely enjoyed the freedom and sought a lot of the world's pleasures and did a lot of things that a Catholic or a Christian, for that matter, a Catholic or Christian man shouldn't do, and I did. And I started going to church less when I was at school. My first degree, my degree at Syracuse was in photojournalism. So I was a journalist and a photographer. And I stayed after graduating. I stayed in upstate New York, and I lived in a couple of small cities called Auburn, New York, where I worked my first newspaper, and then a few years later moved to Utica, New York, where I worked at the Observer Dispatch newspaper.
Gotcha. Is that the newspaper that ends up sending you to the little church?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. So that unless there's an event in there, that might be a good place to go into how you actually met the Lord.
Yeah, it was definitely not my doing. Um, Again, unexpected. But it was a small to medium sized newspaper, and it was pretty diverse. The city of Utica and the surrounding area had a great deal of diversity, not only Hispanic, but some unusual or unexpected nationalities. There was something like 20% of the population was from Bosnia, so there were a lot of Bosnian refugees. There were a lot of Belarusian refugees. So it was a very diverse community. Um, and our newspaper, the Observer Dispatch, was very interested in delving into diversity in a variety of ways. And one of those ways was they wanted to highlight a couple of local churches that were bilingual uh, churches.
Yeah.
And yeah,
As you know, I'm probably a traditional conservative for the most part, although that's changing a little. But you don't think of newspapers, even in a small town, being very interested in churches.
you don't. No, I mean, the sort of traditional image of the media is, and fairly or not fairly, tend to be a little more on the left side, a little more liberal, less likely to talk about faith or church. So it was a little unusual. They did have a sort of weekly church page, it had the listing of all the masses and services, and it's a heavily Catholic community around Utica. Um, but not typically given a lot of time and a lot of space in the newspaper.
Yeah. Okay. So it was unusual that they were doing that. So I guess is what I'm highlighting. Like it's that that they were going to send somebody to go cover churches just doesn't
Right.
normally happen. Yeah.
Definitely not.
So when you
Uh,
say it's outside of your control, might be the first. That's the first thing.
yeah, and it wasn't even really where I wanted to go. It wasn't.
Hmm.
I was interested in the topic, but there was another church that I wanted to go to, and I ended up being teamed up with this beautiful woman that I had a great deal of interest in. Her name was Krista, and I had met her a few times. We'd worked together on a couple of small projects, but um, let's just say I had a extracurricular interest in her that didn't always have to do with the headlines or
Right.
the photos in the paper.
Sure.
And so I had an idea of what church I wanted to go to, and they said, well, we're not going to send you to that church. We're going to send you to this church called Calvary Gospel Church. They said there's a lot of people from the former USSR, what's now Belarus, and I was going to be working with Krista on doing a profile of this church, and so it started a multi-month odyssey of going to meet the pastor, going to meet the parishioners, meeting a lot of the people who were not from the United States, a lot of Belarusians, a lot of Russians, um, and it was really obviously the Lord's work, and because
Hmm.
they gave us an incredible amount of freedom to go to this church. I mean, we were going sometimes 2-3 times a week. I think we were working on it for 4 or 6 months, which is really unheard of at a small newspaper. And we were going, we'd go to Sunday service, we'd go to Wednesday Bible study, we'd go and we'd talk to some of the homes. We had Thanksgiving dinner at a Belarusian family, and keep in mind that many of these people, especially the older members of the church who were in their 70s and 80s and older, they didn't speak a word of English. So
Yeah.
we relied heavily on interpreters to communicate with them. And there was certainly a lot of communication, sort of unspoken. They would grab your hands and look in your eyes, and just it was really inspiring. But what was really powerful was just to hear the story of their faith and their belief that when they were in their 20s and 30s in Russia, um, that the Lord had told them that they would someday be in a land where they would have the freedom to worship, and they wouldn't have to look over their shoulder for fear of being caught. And the stories these people were told were just really remarkable.
Yeah. Well, can you tell us a couple of those stories? Like, how did so God gave him this message. How did he give him that message? Did he say?
Well, they were spoken to in dreams when they were much younger, 40, 50 years before this,
Mm-hmm.
in the USSR, and he had just given them the hope, the faith to believe that there would be a day when they would be free to worship, and they they just truly believed, and these people had believed at the risk of life and limb. They could have been imprisoned for believing in the USSR and being a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And the stories that they told through these interpreters were just remarkable, and their patience and their faith was really what talked to me. I wasn't. I was really interested in the stories and in the pictures, and I spent a lot of time behind the camera. But the Lord was obviously working on my heart at this time when I just was really being impacted by them talking. And some of them, some of the older women had taken Krista, the reporter, aside, and fortunately she didn't tell me this until much later. But they had taken her aside and they said, "We know you are going to get married to Trevor, and we know that he's not a Christian, but he will be." And they knew some of Krista's background, which she had not shared with them, um, and uh, they just spoke to her, and I didn't find that out until after we ended up getting married. It's
Wow.
probably good. It probably would have sent me running if I had known that they had known that about us.
Right. Which is
Yeah,
so.
but
So these guys. I mean, they're. It's sort of a mystical kind of faith that they have. It sounds like.
yeah, and it's. I mean, these people have, and many of them are dead now. Some of them died while we were there, even in the short time, the 6 months that we worked on the project. Um, we had one woman. Her name was Tatiana. She was in her 70s or 80s. She only spoke three expressions in English. She said, "Come to church." Said, "God bless you," and she would spend weeks at a time just inside the doors of a grocery store handing out cards saying, "Come to church." And it was a card that Calvary Gospel had reproduced and handed out and invited people to come to the service. And she ended up dying either. I think it was just before we published the story, and just before her funeral, the pastor got up and asked everybody in the church who had gotten a card from Tatiana and had come because of her. They asked them to stand up, and it was 15 or 20% of the church. That was easily
Wow.
100 people. And again, she didn't. Her extent of English was very limited, to say the least. And it was a hard life in Russia, and they just truly kept the faith, and they just talked about believing, and it was pretty powerful testimony.
Yeah, that's amazing. One of the things that I've kind of learned from this doing the show is that it doesn't matter who you are if you're just faithful to the little piece that God has given you, you're going to have a huge impact. There's a couple stories that I've heard where, so in some cases, the people who shared the gospel. Just didn't they didn't even really know if anybody had accepted it or not. And the guy turned out to be an evangelist who's preached the gospel all over the world.
Mm,
Has no idea. Um, and same thing with Tatiana, right? It's just this little, she's just faithful to the one thing she can do, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
and that has had a tremendous effect on all these people, including you.
yeah. It was a truly inspirational place to be, and the pastor and the people were really heartwarming and just made us feel welcomed. And we ended up joining the church and becoming members of the church after the story was published. We wouldn't have done it before it was published. It would have been a sort of violation of journalistic ethics, but um, we just immediately felt welcomed, and there was no question that was too small. And the pastor was delighted to spend lots of time with us, and people were very honest and candid about their struggles with just earthly struggles, but their faith that didn't seem to be affected. And it's an amazing church.
Yeah. So this small community of Belarusian believers had this impact on you. So did you remember a moment, or how did you come to faith personally through this?
Sadly, I don't have one of those
Which
light
is okay, by the
sun
way.
shining through the cloud moments where you hear a voice. Says my coming to faith wasn't quite that dramatic, but it just was a time that it seemed like it clicked, and
Mm.
I understood it in a way that made sense, um, and I could believe it, and I think it was very much helped by the personal stories that these
Mm.
Russians had told us. Just seeing and hearing about their faith um, really was dramatic, and it was just powerful to see that these people lived through this and believed for this and for decades, 40, 50 years, knew that there would be a better time, but they didn't know when. And years later, there's several dozen, if not 100 Belarusians who are all at this church in the middle of upstate New York. Was really a powerful testimony, not only to their faith, but to faithfulness of God,
Yeah.
and just how he really he just touches people's lives, and like we said, in unexpected ways. And
Right.
the first time I walked into that church, I didn't think it would be something that would impact the rest of my life. I thought it was going to be a great story, and it was. I mean, the newspaper gave multiple pages. It ran over multiple days, and it was pretty well received. But the impact was personal for me and
Right.
for my wife.
Which is interesting because the story gets published in a newspaper and then it goes away, and a week later everybody's recycling that, right? But
Yeah,
even though you spent 6 months working on it, uh, but the impact in your life is forever, literally forever.
yeah, absolutely. And that was just the beginning of the Lord's work in my life. So my wife and I ended up getting married in 2005, and she got a job, and we ended up, after getting married, ended up moving out west to the Seattle area. So we needed. I wasn't familiar with the Pacific Northwest. She grew up in Portland, Oregon, but not Seattle. So we were trying to find a church to worship at, and my brother-in-law, who I mentioned before, Rob, had sent me, back in the days of CDs, sent me like 2 or 3 towers of CDs of these great sermons. And this was before we got married and before we were even engaged. It was just about a bunch of sermons, easily 100 sermons on the Bible, New and Old Testament. And uh,
Hmm.
in the Lord's plan, these sermons were all from Mars Hill Church, which was in Seattle, Washington.
Yeah.
So we found ourselves in the Seattle area, and we didn't fancy ourselves megachurch people, but we said, well, the sermons are really great, so I mean, it can't hurt to go listen. And we ended up attending Mars Hill Church for the entire time that we were out there, and felt that it was God's hand guiding us to the next stop in our faith, our marriage, and it was just a really good time for us. Great preaching, tremendous community. I mean, we lived in this little mid-sized city called Everett, Washington, and there were 20 or 30 members of Mars Hill Church within 6 blocks of our house. We didn't know that at the time,
Hmm.
but it's just was part of his plan, and we just had great community in our neighborhood, and it was just really instrumental in helping to get through the first few years of marriage, and just the challenges of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is always it can be a great time, and it's a challenging time to kind of integrate your lives, as those of us who are married know. Um, but that's interesting. So I love what Rob did there to send you some CDs and with some resources. So he really, it sounds like he was somebody who was instrumental in helping you kind of in the early discipleship of your walk.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was discipleship from a distance. We didn't really live
Sure.
near each other. I think he lived out west and then in Quebec at the time. But we met a few times. He'd met before I was saved, and of course he'd sent my trunk of my old Mercedes was filled with CDs of all these sermons, and I would just pop it into my CD player and listen to them while I was driving around. And it definitely had an impact on. And he's a pastor, he's a God loving
Hmm.
man, and just really great, inspiring brother-in-law, and he loves the Lord and loves his family, and it's been yeah,
Yeah,
it's been
awesome.
great.
Well, that's cool. I never got a chance to go to Mars Hill. What was it that you guys liked besides just the? I mean, obviously the sermons are good, but it's an interesting place up there.
Yeah, unfortunately it had its tough times after we left, but
Yeah.
the preaching was amazing. The preaching was solid and biblical, and his Mark Driscoll's audience was really geared toward um, men largely, and
Mm,
talking to single men. And I wasn't a single man, but I was a new Christian, and it just really spoke to me and spoke to us. And the worship music was just really second to none. I mean, I hear a lot of strong arguments against worship bands that are, bordering on performance, and I understand that. But I felt like I was one of those people that the music spoke to me, and really, I just felt like I could really worship. The music was great. It was um, just really powerful. I just
yeah.
really enjoyed it, and I miss it even to this day. Now I live in the Washington D.C. area, and I attend a great church of about 1,000 people. But the music is very different, and I still miss Mars Hill for the music.
Mm.
Absolutely, it was just really a great way to worship, and just spoke to my heart. So
Yeah, I think there's something about worship music that when it's done badly, I think it's performance. When it's done well, it draws you into it, right? And it draws everybody in the room into um what might be even an emotional experience of God and who he is. Um and I don't know if that's what you're describing or not, but in my opinion, that's where I feel like I'm not one of those guys who would say that it shouldn't be a performance. I think that is about the only time in our worship services that we actually engage the emotion, engage the heart. Most of the other stuff we do engages the head,
yeah,
for the most
yeah,
part, right? And so
yeah.
man, no, it's totally important to engage the heart, in our worship services because we're not just, spiritual heads.
Yeah, it's like another language.
Yeah.
It's another Some people speak English and French, some people worship in different ways, and some people worship the Lord through the music that they have a connection to. And I felt like I was one of those people who really benefited. I don't think it was a situation where we were worshiping the people who were singing up on the stage, but we were just worshiping the Lord through the hymns and just the music, and I just felt like it really connected with me,
Yeah.
and I'm grateful for it. Um, yeah.
Did you get involved there? Did you, or either there, kind of maybe the next leg of your journey, where did you find some things that you really enjoyed being involved in and serving in?
We were active in childcare to a limited extent. We had a pretty active community group
Hmm.
because it had at one. By the time they closed, Mars Hill Church had something like 10 campuses, and we moved to a campus closer to our house north of Seattle. So we had a pretty active community and community groups, and we did a lot of things in our town. Um, so that was I was active in that respect, but I just felt like we did a lot of life with people from our church every day. Um, People we worked with, people we had walked by their houses, our kids would share meals with them. Um, we just did life, and it was really good to have the accountability.
Hmm.
Um, Knowing, sometimes accountability can be awkward, and there were those times for sure.
Indeed.
When you fall short of the glory of God, uh, but it was uh, the community was pretty powerful, and I think it was one of the things that sustained us when we were in the Seattle area. Just enjoyed being around people who believed what you believed and were not shy about talking to their neighbors about what we believed,
Hmm.
and it was a great place to be, and God's plan was perfect.
Yeah, it sounds like that community really shaped you.
It did. It
Yeah.
did. I still have dear friends up there that I haven't seen in a few years, but it's just really great to be able to live life with them. And I went to nursing school when I was at Mars Hill, and so I changed careers. I sort of my wife is still in journalism, but I in God's perfect plan, my house was across the street from a community college, and while I looked for jobs in photography or photojournalism for a while, there weren't a lot of jobs, and I saw the makings of an industry that was getting smaller and getting much much more competitive.
Right.
And if it was part of the Lord's plan that I would have a family, I wanted to have a way to support my family. So I ended up going to nursing school during that time. Went to the nursing school right across the street. The other end of the street was a hospital that I did a lot of my clinicals in, and yeah, it just helped during a pretty stressful time. Nursing schools, a lot of time commitment, and required a lot of grace from my wife.
Yeah, I bet. But wow. Okay. Well, that seems like God's provision for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I would have seen that one coming, but I had while I was in high school and after college, I had been an EMT and a paramedic and that sort of thing,
Okay.
and I'd worked for an ambulance, and it just seemed like my past experiences um, just dovetailed nicely into nursing. Um, my wife and I were coming back from a canoeing trip one day in upstate New York, and the car had turned over and ended up in the water just before we had come around the corner. So I jumped out of the car, and everybody was fine. It was not very dramatic or exciting, but it was kind of like it reminded me of just how exciting it had been to work in medicine and work as an EMT. And when when we moved to Washington State, nursing school was right there. So
Gotcha. Oh yeah. So that woke something up in you.
yeah, it definitely did. Something that had been dormant a while.
Uh huh. Interesting. See, I look at events like that, and I see that God sees it not only well, I guess He uses those right to call things out of us in ways that we don't necessarily expect, like we were talking about. Um, that sounds like you didn't plan on doing nursing. You were going to be a journalist,
Right.
but
Yep.
God kind of called that out of you, and it had always been there, right? But He called it out with this one event.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of respects. being a nurse is a small glimpse of Christ-like service.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you have an opportunity. I've only worked in emergency rooms since I graduated from nursing school, and you have a lot of opportunities to see people on what may very well be the worst day of their life or the worst day of their kids' lives. I now work at a children's hospital in DC, and
Oh yeah.
it's a major trauma center, and there's a lot of hard times, and it's just an opportunity to really try to serve parents and their kids in a small way, not in a way that gets big headlines or people even remember who you are, but if you can make their day a little better,
Yeah.
I feel like you're playing a small role in
Well, you're playing the
helping
role
them.
of Christ to them.
Yeah, I would hope that I could have a small impact,
Right.
to have Christ-like service. It's,
Yeah. Oh, that's
yeah.
what a great view of that. Um, so how do you deal with all that stuff as just personally? I would think in situations that are so emotionally charged that it would be difficult personally. Like I'm just more of a feeler, but I'm wondering about you. Are you like do you take on the feelings of other people or do you like does that bother you or is it
I'm a father of two girls. I've got a 5-year-old. Her name is Verity, and a 2-year-old. Her name is Beatrice. And I find that I can usually put the emotions out of my head until I see someone who looks like one of my daughters, or I see
wow.
someone who's the same age as one of my daughters. Um, Not too long ago, I they had a call for a tree that fell on a child, and the child didn't live, and the child was 2,
Wow.
and it was pretty sad. I held it together fine when we were trying to take care of the kid. Um, but then after, when you got a chance to think about it, it was right at the end of shift. And I started walking down the hallway to go home, and I saw one of the doctors crying in the hallway, and I just hugged her. I actually didn't know this doctor, and I just said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I have a 2-year-old at home, and
Yeah.
my 2-year-old has a sandbox as well, just like this child who died." And sometimes it really hits home, and it's really helpful to to believe that we if as believers we have a heaven
Mhm.
to believe in, and a place where there won't be any crying, and there won't be any sadness. And sometimes it just takes that perspective to remember. And it's a hard place sometimes, and yeah, sometimes it's just a hard place to work, but um, it's good to feel like you can have a small impact on kids and parents' lives. And even every once in a while, I'll see someone, and I'm not great with names or faces, but I'll be like, "We've met before," but I'm always afraid to ask.
Yeah, sure.
Like, did I meet you at the grocery store, or did I meet you at the hospital? And sometimes they'll be like, "Aren't you a nurse?" And we sort of have that shared connection. And I won't remember the specifics most of the time, but
Right.
did they sometimes remember the good care they got from the staff at my hospital? And um, yeah,
Yeah, that sounds rewarding. Um
it is. It's rewarding while challenging. It's can be has its
yeah.
ups and downs for sure.
Yeah, like anything, but in this case some, life threatening. Um
Yeah.
so I'm curious about your spiritual journey kind of since that time. Like are do you find cuz you mentioned the, sort of the theological piece of okay, keeping eternity in mind, which, is a good thing to keep in mind. I've been telling people lately for whatever reason um talking about, living to about 100 at work today and like I don't really want to live to 100. My theology means I don't have to. You know what I mean? Like just
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. I think if I'm 100, I'm gonna be mad at somebody. But Um, it's but theologically, hey, I'm okay if I don't do that. But I'm curious about what that spiritually does to you, and you know, kind of maybe along with that, have you had times that when God has felt sort of distant or far away, or do you find that He's really close in those moments, or is there another time that God has felt distant from you?
There are, part of being married, the ups and downs, the challenges is keeping eternity in mind.
Mm,
Um, and I feel like I've got a lot to learn about being a dad and a husband, and I just try to remember that every day because uh, I'm still learning. I've been married 12 years, and I think marriage is probably the most challenging endeavor I've ever been involved in, for sure. It's just learning to learn learning to love one another and live with one another, and learning to learn about myself. It's just not, I don't know myself very well, and that leads to a lot of challenges. Um, yeah, it sounds kind of like an oxymoron to not know yourself, but I don't know. I'm the only person I've ever known, and turns out that sometimes I don't know myself very well.
yeah.
And
Well, I think we misjudge our own motivations a lot. I find that true with me anyway. I'd like to think the best of my own intentions, and that's not always true. you know, I don't know. Maybe you have that experience.
yeah, I feel like what drives me a lot is pride, and I spend a lot of time thinking about me, and instead of thinking about other people, my wife or my kids, and it's something I'm working on all the time,
Mm,
and um, I'm grateful that the Lord is abounding in grace and mercy.
yeah.
And it's something I tell my girls about all the time because I try to be candid with my daughters when I sin, when I get upset, when I'm just not the dad I should be, or the husband I should be, and I try to be upfront about that and just say, "Girls, I'm sorry. Papa's a sinner." Um, and I apologize to my girls and just tell them I'm sorry. I I did this, or I'm sorry I got upset, or I'm sorry I didn't go and read the book to you, or whatever it is that day. And I think it's every day try to remember that, and tell my girls about that I don't think they have any mistaken notions that their dad is perfect. That's for
Yeah.
sure. And but they hopefully have ears to hear that God is, and that's something to believe in.
Yeah.
And we've seen changes even in Verity, who's 5. Just maybe the first inklings of faith, belief.
Mm,
It's hard to say. I think she's 5,
right.
but she is a thinker, and she may say something in anger, but then 15 minutes later she'll come back and say, "Papa, I'm really sorry that I said this. I shouldn't have said this." And I didn't say anything to her. I didn't force her to apologize. She just came to me, and often comes to me and my wife on her own volition, and she just feels convicted about something she did or something she said, or how she said something in anger. And I'm beginning
Wow.
to perhaps see the working of the Lord in my daughter. And
Yeah.
it's again, she's 5, but sometimes it's really humbling to see the things that the connections she makes, and
Right.
yeah,
Well,
that's pretty powerful.
what I hear in that is, in light of what you just said about the way that you speak to your kids about your own, vulnerably about your own, sin or treatment of people. Um, it sounds like she's adopting that as well, right? Um, so your godly example, is having an effect there.
I hope so. I mean,
Yeah.
I hope I'm humble enough, and I hope she doesn't remember the times that I sin, but does remember the times that I repent. We don't we
Right.
don't want her to remember the bad things, um, but we wanted to um, just remember there's a Lord that we pray to every night,
Yeah.
and he's perfect. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the verse in 2 Corinthians, um, where Paul says, "I I will on behalf of this man I will boast." This is 2 Corinthians 12, verse 5. On behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses.
Hmm.
And I've just spent a lot of time thinking about that, just because um, it's not my strength
Yeah.
that any of this happens. It's not my great plan. Um, it's just his plan and his grace, and it just yeah, it just helps me to remember. Just I won't do these things through my strength.
Yeah.
It's
Which
sometimes being a dad or a husband or a man, you want to think that you can fix it. You want to think that you can solve the problem, and it's usually out of our control.
yeah, well, I hear that in you, brother. I hear that I hear humility and grace and acceptance of God and His work in your life, which I think is just really inspiring, and it makes me just want to do the same.
Thanks.
Um, okay, well, how'd you get from Seattle to Washington?
It was a '96 Camry, four door, had a canoe on the top, dog in the back seat.
Nice.
Uh, we decided to move across the country. My wife was gracious enough to tolerate 3 years of nursing school and school before nursing school, and she had an opportunity to work in journalism, and she wanted to go to the big city at some point. And Washington D.C. would be the big city, uh, or at least the next big city.
Yeah,
So she had an opportunity. Unfortunately, I had a lot of freedom as a nurse.
sure.
There were a lot of opportunities to work at hospitals in the DC area, so it would be a lot easier for me to find a job. So she had a job, I found one, and we ended up moving to DC in about 2010.
Oh, gotcha.
And ironically, on the last Sunday that we were at Mars Hill Church, we were leaving out a side entrance, and Mark Driscoll, ironically, was standing there shaking hands as we were leaving. And
Oh wow.
we just took a minute. I mean, he's not someone that we often saw as we were leaving church, and we just took a minute to thank him. And we told him we were leaving, and we asked him on a lark. We said, "Do you have any recommendations for churches in the DC area? We're moving." And he says, "Well, it's a little bit different from Mars Hill, but if you're open to it, you should check out Capitol Hill Baptist Church." And it's a church in the heart of Capitol Hill in DC. Um, and we've been there pretty much since the first week. We never even looked at another church.
Wow,
Yeah, so
that's a great
it's
story.
yeah. I mean, it's probably only the second or third conversation we'd ever had with Pastor Mark Driscoll, and in full disclosure, he said it was nothing like Mars Hill, and it is very different. I mean, it believes in the same God and the same
Sure.
Bible for sure. That is absolutely unchanged, but the music and the worship is very different. But just we're just really fortunate that we didn't have to go looking very hard for a church, and we were there since day one, and felt really blessed to have been again in a great church.
Wow.
Very different model. We went from having 10 campuses at Mars Hill to one campus, one church at Capitol Hill.
Right.
And again, um, we moved a couple times in the first couple years in DC, but now we live in Maryland outside of DC, and we're in a small town of 100 families from our church. Ironically, it's a little town
Wow.
called Cheverly, Maryland, and it's just a town that it seems like is really well received by people at our church. Among others, it's several thousand people in this town, but
Yeah.
we just again have an opportunity, being blessed with the community, and within 3 blocks, we've got 5 or 6 families that are dear friends. We can go down to the bottom of the hill with our girls, and they can go see Emmy and Georgia, their best friends. We can go to the playground and stop by and
Hmm.
pick them up on the way, and it's just really been a real blessing.
Yeah. Wow, that keeps coming up. Like you like wherever you go, you find community. Why do you think that is?
I think it's I think it's the Lord's doing.
Huh.
I think is it is just really it's really important to us to again be able to live with people every day, be able to be in the neighborhood and borrow a cup of flour or a gallon of milk or something, um, with people that we know and we love and that we can confide in. We have community groups here in Cheverly. I go to a men's small group on Tuesdays, and we go to a community group on other alternating Wednesdays, and it's all people who live near and around us. And it just really helps to do life together.
Hmm.
It's um,
What
some
what kinds of things do you do?
we have people over for dinner. We see each other all the time at the playground. We've all got kids. We all seem to have a baby boom 2 years ago. So it seems like there's 30 or 40 families that all have a bunch of 2-year-olds now.
Wow.
And we sometimes drive together to church. If someone's going early, we'll caravan in, and um, we'll pick up things. We'll make sure that when they're sick, that someone can take their kids to school, stuff like that. Just um, being able to help out one another. And I think there's a level of candor,
Hmm.
honesty, when you live life together, and you can be more than just surface. They know your struggles, or at least some of them. They know the
Yeah.
hard times you're having. They know your successes and your joy. But the better you know people, the more you realize, while on the surface it looks like they have everything made, they have this perfect family, that they have struggles. They have struggles too, and it's uh, it's good to be able to call, or to have a beer with a friend,
Yeah.
believes in the same God that you do, and just be able to pour a little bit into each other's lives. I think
Yeah.
that's
You use
I
that
don't
word.
know where we would be without being in community. Honestly, it'd be a very different faith.
Right. Well, you use that word transparency, and I think that's right. That sort of vulnerability, to be willing to share your life with somebody, um, the good and the bad, and the ups and the downs, is really super important. And it sounds to me like you're really good at it.
I'm not as good as I should be, but it
You're
is definitely,
practiced.
yeah, it's definitely humbling to share your struggles. Um, yeah, it's humbling to know
Yeah.
that you're not the only person, you're not the only couple, you're not the only family, you're not the only one who has kids that has a meltdown right before dinner. It's something
Right.
as
Oh man, that's the worst.
simple. Yeah, and it's just times like that to know that um, this is not unique. You are not the first person to go through this, nor the last, and
Mm,
it's really helpful to just be able to live life
yeah.
together in some small way.
Yeah. That's awesome. What's God doing with you right now?
Right now, just trying to work on work on my marriage and my family.
Hmm.
Just trying to be the husband that my wife needs, the dad that my kids deserve, and to be. I'm just really putting a lot of energy into that, and um, I'm not someone who makes a lot of friends, but the few very dear friends I have, we just talk about our real life struggles together and our real life successes. And I don't there's no other nurses. I'm friends with engineers and teachers and this and that, but to have a common faith, even if your workplace is different, even if your house looks different or your marriage looks different, um, is helpful.
Yeah.
It really helps us to be able to pour into each other
Oh, that's
and
awesome.
be, yeah.
Oh, cool.
He's a good God. He's
Yeah.
pretty awesome.
Amen. Well, I think your life is a testimony to that. And I appreciate you sharing it with us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. I appreciate the opportunity a lot.
Yeah, you bet. Wow, Trevor, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. That was amazing. I love the way that God has used community in your life. That was a really powerful message that just, I think, speaks from your life with God. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. We need to hear that. Friends, I hope that you have a community that you can hang out with and really share life, the ups and the downs. And if nowhere else, even if you can't find that at a local church, you can do that right here with the Halfway There podcast community. Definitely go over to the Halfway There podcast Facebook page. You can do that. And I think I'm looking at starting a Facebook group where we can get together and share some of our stories outside of just a formal interview like I usually do. If you're interested in something like that, would you go to halfwaytherepodcast.com, click on the show notes page for this episode, and let me know. Or hit the contact button. You can send me an email as well. I'd love to know if you'd be interested in connecting with other people who have stories to share, like Trevor's, like mine, like yours. Guys, don't forget that if you're in the Denver area, Keith Giles is coming to town, and we need signups. I need to know if you want to go. So you can also, again, go to halfwaytherepodcast.com, click on this episode. I've got a link right there in the show notes to see that you can get into the event page and get signed up. It's $15, which is a real bargain. Keith is an interesting guy. Sign up and go ahead and come out to that. And I'd love to meet you there. That would be a lot of fun. Okay. So with that, thanks a lot, Trevor. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Tell a friend, and we'll catch you next week. Keep the faith.